Eminem Revival.
Was it that bad?
Well, released back in 2017. It's been a few years since the album now, and we thought we'd go over it and see if it is truly as bad as it was received at the time.
So when this was released was just about a year later after Eminem's BET Freestyle, which was where we got the "That's an awfully hot coffee pot." So people were already not in the greatest of mindsets about Eminem's work, and this album coming off the back of that really didn't help solidify things for him.
It still did well commercially, got number one in the US, number one in the UK, and topped a lot of other charts across Europe, etc. But shall we jump into the album and give some thoughts on each track and what we think of them now, many years later?
Let's do it. Coming up first is the lead single from the album, which is Walk on Water featuring Beyonce. What did you think?
This kind of has a little bit of reminiscent value for me because it did quite well in the charts and it reminds me of Been of That Age. I actually think it's an all right track. It's very pop-centered. You knew it'd do well in the charts. I don't think it's one of Eminem's best songs, but I think as an opener to the album, it's okay, and it left me with higher hopes going into the album.
Yeah, listening back to this album, this song, I remember not liking it at the time. Listening again now, I've kind of got a newfound respect for it. Eminem's really laying himself out on the track. There's a lot of like feelings and emotion included. And Beyonce's feature actually goes pretty hard, I can't lie.
Yeah, it works well, although the transition into the next song, which is Believe, was horrible.
I really liked it. When he goes, bitch, I wrote Stan.
Nah.
Started from the bottom like a snowman.
I hated it, man. I thought it was choppy. It didn't feel like an album transition. It just sounded like shouting. I really didn't appreciate the transition. And to be honest, I thought Believe itself, I didn't appreciate. It was just okay. It was just a song that exists with nothing unique about it.
There was a lot of classic production on it because this is an M-produced track, and there was a very loud feature from M's classic hi-hat throughout, and it was a minimalistic beat. I didn't hate it, but as an Eminem track, you could this didn't have to be there.
I just thought the flow on it for me was really choppy, switched up a few times, and just I didn't vibe with it. Do you know when you're just not down with how it's done at all?
Yeah, his flow was very questionable on this track, but moving off this one onto the next, which was Chloroseptic featuring Fresher.
I thought this was one of the better tracks on the entire album. Really liked this, thought the feature worked well, unique style beat that was pretty cool. I just like this song. I genuinely think maybe this would be my favourite on the entire album.
Interestingly, this has got the lowest amount of plays on Spotify, sitting at just shy of 37 million. So to say that that's the lowest amount of listens on an album and it's a bad album, 37 million, you can't turn your nose up at that, can you? Really?
No, there's still a hell of a lot, but I can see why it's classed as not his best work still.
I didn't like it that much on the original, but off the back of this, I think it was about a month later, they released the Chloroseptic remix, which had a couple of other features on it. And we also got a really fire M verse at the end because the beat was a lot harder and it was kind of more, I don't know, it was a bigger track, and without this track, we wouldn't have got the remix. So you've got to give respect to this one. And like you say, you enjoyed it, I enjoyed it. Not too bad.
And then we move on to Untouchable, which was a song from the point of view of the police.
Yeah, for me, I can't defend the first half of this track. I really don't like it. But when the beat switches a couple of minutes in and we go back to classic M from mid to late 2000s, that's when I was like, all right, this track has got some legs to it, but that first half, I don't think there's anybody out there that can defend that.
I completely agree. I've literally got wrote down the first half of the song for a topic like that felt like a joke. Mm-hmm. The beat was horrible. Some of the bars were a bit weird. I didn't like the first half. And to be honest, it's one of those where if I wasn't listening to this album to review it in this manner, I'd have probably skipped it by the time it got to the second half because I really hated it.
Yeah, it takes a long time to get to that beat switch.
I wish it was two separate tracks so that then I could say one's awful, one's great. But because they're together, it just makes it a whole lot of mid.
Yeah, it's just a mid track. Again, another one that the album questionably could have done without. Moving off that, we go into River featuring Ed Sheeran.
Classic pop track, innit? I mean, I actually don't mind this one. I think weirdly the vibes of Eminem and Ed Sheeran worked better than I expected because I remember when this came out and I thought, what is this going to be like?
So I completely think the opposite of that. I understand why Ed and M do so much work together. That's fun to say, Ed and M. Ed and M is a new artist. They should do a collab project. But for me, I don't really like how their styles mix together because they've done other tracks before. They've done a lot of work together. It makes sense. Ed's a big fan of Eminem, like we say. But they did Remember the Name with 50 Cent as well. and that didn't feel right either.
I thought this was better than that, though.
You reckon?
I just quite liked the way that Ed brought the energy down and then Eminem took it back up. And I just thought it was like, again, I'm not saying it's a fantastic Eminem track. I just think in this album, it's one of the better ones.
And this has got 850 million listens. This is the top track off the album. And comparing that to Walk on Water's 180, which comes in second, that's just so shitty. Because I feel like there is much better tracks hidden throughout this album than this one.
This is just both of them two at the top of the game, though, isn't it? It was always going to do well commercially.
One line I really like from this, I've got a couple of tracks where I've written down just one line that I really enjoy. So she's been on the web lately, says she'll be my Gwen Stacy to Spider-Man. But the way that he says it is to Spider-Man. And I just like that. Gwen Stacy, Spider-Man. Clever. He's a clever man. He's a clever man. Moving off that, we go into Remind Me.
This really reminded me of Berserk. Obviously, I know it's got the sample in there, and it's not Berserk, but it's the same style Eminem, but it's nowhere near as good.
So interestingly, this track has Rick Rubin's paw prints all over it. You can tell this is one of his tracks. It's got the sample of I Love Rock and Roll, which I think is used quite well. But Rick Rubin also produced tracks, including Berserk, on MMLP2, and that was one of the main things that people didn't like about MMLP2. So for him to use Rick Rubin again on this album was a bit of a rogue choice considering the reception.
I actually thought that the sample made it much worse. I thought that the sample, especially with the little chorusy bits, it made the track worse overall, and I really didn't like this at all.
The only bit that I like is when that high-pitched guitar comes in every so often. I can't remember how the tune goes, but I really enjoy that.
But do you think this is a good song?
Not particularly, no. I don't think it's amazing.
Well, just because when you're talking, it's like, oh yeah, I like this bit, and I just don't think it was a good song at all. I thought as a sample as famous as that could have been used in a much better track.
Yeah.
And it left me down.
Also on the back of it, another reason to dislike this track is your booty is heavy duty like diarrhea. Or as he says it, your booty is heavy duty like diarrhea. What a horrible line.
Awful. Eminem's quite good at that, though.
Yeah.
Just horrible honking lines. And then we go on to Like Home featuring Alicia Keys.
This is an obvious diss against Trump. And it's got a great message, but the execution of the track is poor.
It feels like an a cappella track. Really didn't vibe with it. The beat was pretty much non-existent. I mean, it was strange when it did exist, but I could just hear M over everything. It felt like he was talking directly to my skull about Trump, and it doesn't really match up in the modern day.
The mixing across this album is questionable, but something I compare it to, I kind of find it a little bit cringe, because could you imagine a UK rapper rapping that passionately on an entire track about, say, Boris Johnson?
No.
Like, Americans and patriotism have a very weird link together, and I think this track kind of puts that forwards. And to people outside of America, it just feels odd. It just feels weird.
And just like Trump, we move on to the next track, Bad Husband. What do you think of that?
So this is featuring ex-ambassadors and the how come? I fucking hate that hook so much.
It was more a cappella vibes for me.
Yeah.
It just felt like, and I've got this in the end of my notes as well about the album as a whole, this felt like a test. Felt like it should never have come out.
Yeah, it feels almost like the B-sides of previous projects just kind of all jumbled together. This song as a whole, the mixing's all over the place, and it feels a little bit like a humble brag, because he's saying, how can I be a good dad but a bad husband? It's like, bro, don't call yourself a good dad. You're not allowed to call yourself a good thing. It's a bit humble braggy. I don't hate the message that he's putting across, but I do somewhat hate the track.
Yeah, I really didn't like this one. And next, Tragic Endings featuring Skylar Grey.
Skylar fucking Grey, man. That is Eminem's favourite female vocalist by far. I don't think there's been a single project that she hasn't featured on in some capacity.
For me, at this point, right, when we was coming into this track, I was like, I'm really bored. The last few tracks have bored the life out of me. I need something to take the tempo up. And I heard the start of this at the instrumental and thought, oh, this could kick in. Never did. It just left me wanting more.
It really feels like a leftover Recovery track, because you even got Eminem shouting on it. And there's like an unconfirmed theory that a lot of the tracks off this album were actually from Recovery era. And this track in particular, Skylar Grey had a song called Tragic Ending that was released a couple of years prior, or was at least copyrighted, trademarked, whatever you want to say. But that never got released, so people reckon that was a track that M then jumped on. So it definitely feels out of place in this track listing. It's very poppy. M's got his shoutiness on. We
move on. we move on to Framed. Still, I'm begging for something to take the tempo up at this point. I'm in need of a little bit of energy. I actually thought the funky beat on this was one of the better, kind of more experimental beats on the album. Really liked that. And it was my favourite song in the last few. Like, compared to the previous 3 or 4, I thought that this was good. But I still don't think it's an amazing track. I just think it's better than the last few.
But hey man, I was framed. Tell me that doesn't feel like it came directly off of Relapse. I love this fucking song, man. I actually really like it. It just feels like a Relapse track.
I hate doing Eminem stuff with you because you just love him that much that you come out with random stuff and I have no idea what you're on about.
I think with that's part of the track, isn't it?
Yeah, I know, but it's just like every track you reference a different album and I'm like, I have no idea. I don't know that album off by heart.
This is possibly the closest to Prime M on the whole album that we get in terms of his lyricism and his flow. I really enjoy this. There's a little a cappella bit at 150 that I think really adds to the track. Overall, I really like it.
And then we quickly went into Nowhere Fast, which brought it back to the more chill vibes of the previous couple songs. I just want to go to sleep at this point, man.
Yeah, so this is featuring Kalani, and the hook and the beat are very, very boring, in my opinion. M's content lyrically is good, but his flow's a bit choppy and the track's a bit poppy.
And I've got, when you say M's flow is good, if this track was half the length with the same amount of content, I think it would have been all right, but it felt like it dragged on for a lifetime.
Well, no, for me, I don't think his flow was that good. I thought lyrically the content
No, but that's
good.
what I mean. When you say it's a bit choppy, the lyrics are in there, but it just got dragged out for too long of a period. Yeah. If it was half the length with the same content, we'd have been like, oh yeah, that's all right then. But it was just mid. Heat up next.
Woo! Heat. This is another clear Rick Rubin produced track. It uses a sample of Feel the Heat, which interestingly was from the movie Boogie Nights, which this track originally is Mark Wahlberg and John C. Reilly, who you'll probably know from Step Brothers. What a weird-ass sample.
That is strange. But for me, this guitar beat and the fact we've heard it a couple times on the album now just feels redundant. It didn't feel like there was much unique about it. Do you know, I don't know why, obviously with Eminem, it made me think of MGK when he's had kind of guitar-style beats on rap, and I actually think he does a better job of it than Eminem has on these albums, this album.
I'm going to move past that comment and just say I completely understand why many people don't like it, but me personally, I quite like this track. I think I kind of like that rap rocky style. And also the bar, you got buns, I got Asperger's.
I'm offended, so let's move on to that.
Nobody likes me, everybody hates me. Worms.
I thought this was atrocious. Genuinely. There was no redeeming factor for this. There was flutters of great lyricism and a great flow that were just completely ruined by an awful chorus and unbelievably cringy lyrics.
Yeah, the beat sucks ass, I will admit that. Talking about lyrics, do a fake dab and smell my armpits with it, talking about being narcissistic. What the fuck is he talking about?
There was just so many points in this song where I thought, why have you just said that? Why have you ruined the unbelievable flow that comes in at the end with just awfulness throughout?
Well, when I first heard this track back in the day, I really didn't like it, but going back to it, I quite like it because it's just M in your face. It's his classic M in your face kind of Slim Shady-esque style. But one thing I will say is it would have been better if it was actually offensive.
It was just cringy.
It felt like there wasn't much content to it as a whole.
There's no way I can... When you say it's like old school, it's not, because it's forced. It's cringiness to 100%.
Well, I don't know. I quite like it. Moving off that, though, we go into Need Me featuring Pink.
Just a pop song, innit? Eminem didn't even come into this song until 1 minute and 20 seconds into it, at which point he did some background vocals. The first bars were 2 minutes and 10 seconds into it, and then that ended after about a minute and it just went back to Pink. This is a Pink song?
This is a Pink song featuring Eminem, and the thing about this is the mixing is so god-awful, and if you were to remove Eminem from the track, it wouldn't take anything away from it. If you were to replace Pink with a different female artist, it wouldn't add anything or take anything away. This is such a generic phoned in track, and arguably I think one of the worst on the album.
Yeah, I really didn't enjoy this, and it won't be in my head, but what did you think of in your head?
I quite like the Cranberries zombie sample that they use throughout this. I think that's what gives this track such a good hook, because it's already a song that everybody knows, but worked into this beat, I think it's fantastic.
I think of all the samples on the album, this did the best job of actually mixing in with Eminem's style. It was definitely better than the I Love Rock and Roll one. I think it was miles above, and I really like the original Cranberries song, so I think that I'm a slightly biased with this, but I liked it.
We get max energy from Em on this track as well, which I really enjoy. There's a lot of wordplay going on, and if anything, the one thing that's its downside is that it could have done with an extra verse. It felt like it was over before it began, and for a track this good on an album this poor, maybe a little bit more time on it would have been nice.
And then we start to move on to the closing phase of the album with the last two songs, the first of which being Castle. What did you think of that?
Oh my God. These two songs in tandem, they have to be listened one after the other. You can't just listen to one and then not listen to the other. I absolutely adore Castle. I think it's a great track. So this features vocals from Liz Rodriguez, and she's part of the group that the producer is in, so she doesn't actually get a feature on the track. It doesn't say who it is, but I think her vocals add so much to this track that it's a bit unfair that she isn't credited at all.
Yeah, I agree with that actually, and I thought that this was certainly one of the highlights of the album. Quite strong messaging, obviously Haley mentioned in there a few times. I feel like I'm a bit bored of Eminem talking about his daughter, which might seem a bit of a tight thing to say, and that's maybe a little bit rude, but I feel like I hear a name more than I hear my own family's name.
For all of the misses that M's released in his discography, for every album, there's always a couple of gems in there because it's Eminem, so there's always going to be good tracks. And this just goes to show that even at the end of this album, you know, there's still some left in the tank. There's still something to go off. And moving off this, it goes so nicely into A Rose.
I thought that this was a perfect way to close out an album. I think it's a shame that these last two were really good because it shows that the content that Eminem had available was much better than what we saw in the rest of the record. Really liked this. You know, deeper meaning about being in hospital, etc. I appreciate that sentiment, and I thought that it was a nice way to end it.
Yeah, there's a lot of references to Proof in this track as well, which always breaks my heart because, like, bro lost his best friend and he's still hurting about it. And anytime that he talks about people that he's lost, nobody can lay their emotions out on a track like M does. I feel like he fully just puts everything out there, and the lyricism and the flows added to that. He's just he's a great artist.
But onto the album as a whole, I don't want the last two songs to cloud my judgment because they were quite good. But when I look back over my listening experience with this, I thought, geez, it was just boring for long periods. There was a lot more pop focus, which I appreciate worked in the moment. They got, you know, some big singles from it, but it's just really not for me. What were your thoughts?
It was obvious that it was trying to replicate the success of Recovery by going down that poppier vibe, you know, with Love the Way You Lie and all those big tracks that came off that. But it felt a bit more phoned in. It felt like he was putting way less effort in and getting tracks that just felt really lackluster throughout. There was no real big bangers off this album that hit like Recovery did. Felt like a bit of a flop. And I don't understand why he doesn't get the fact that if he did a full album of those last two songs, all heartfelt and throughout the whole thing, it'd be an incredible project. That'd top charts.
And also, why is every single track, bar like two, over 4 minutes long? Like, I appreciate that, you know, there's a lot to say, but this is why it felt so dragged out. I think if the overall time spent on each track was lower, the content was more compressed, it would have been so much better. Because literally, for most songs, I was thinking, fucking hell, is this going to end yet? Can I, like, move to a different vibe? And then the next vibe was just as bad, just as chill and a whole lot or nothing.
So none of the pop tracks on this album are any good, and there's literally about 5 of them. There's several retro rap rock tracks like on MMLP2, and there's songs that sounded like they belonged on Revival. There's no real cohesion throughout the album. It feels like there's just so many different varying styles, and you can't really get into the album as a whole because it just keeps fucking throwing you one way, then going, oh, do you remember this guy? Do you remember this version of Eminem? What about this? Will this do well? And it felt like he was throwing everything at the wall, seeing what stuck, and none of it did.
I completely agree. And I think one thing that proves this more than anything, and maybe even proves the way in which Eminem looks back at this album, is in Curtain Call 2, the only tracks from this that made it on there were the features. None of his individual tracks, just the ones that did commercially well with Beyonce and Ed Sheeran and stuff. So I think even Eminem surely looks back at this as a bit of a miss.
You could cut this album down to around 10 or 11 songs, and I think it would boost it up the rankings easily. There's so much filler throughout this album. Cut it down, condense it, make your own little playlist, and you might enjoy this album. Outside of that, as an Eminem project, but was it really that bad?
I would say, yes, it was that bad. As an album listening experience, I really didn't have a good time and thought it just left me wanting more consistently.
So as an Eminem project, as a very large Eminem fan, I have to admit that this is a flop of an album. This was a bad album.
What would you rate it out of 10? Going back, listening to it after all these years, what would you give it?
I would give it a 4.5 out of 10.
Wow. I'm close there with you. I'd give it a 4 out of 10. I think there's 1 or 2 tracks on there that I quite liked, but most of it, especially compared to the rest of Eminem's discography, was very poor.
Yeah, there's not really much to say that you can defend this album with. As with any Eminem project, as we've said, there is some gems littered throughout there, but there's not enough of them amongst the fucking insane amount of tracks that are so mid to really bring it back up the rankings. And if you're comparing this to his previous projects, this is easily one of his worst.
Well, if you got to this point in the video, leave your thoughts on the album in the comments, and we're going to be doing more of these for artists like Kanye West, Blink-182, some probably like Arctic Monkeys, a lot of bands and stuff as well. So if you like the format, hit subscribe.
Yeah, and don't forget to let us know what you thought at the time of album release as well. I'm quite interested to hear that. But yeah, as Joe says, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Peace.